Thank you very much. Hi, everyone. I'm thrilled to be here. Absolutely honored to be part of this organizing committee for the event today. I have been following the climate adaptation forums since they first began, and it seems to me like maybe a dozen people in a big room. And over the couple of years that Sustainable Solutions Lab and the Environmental Business Council have been organizing this, they have brought just absolutely stellar panels and just parades of people to Boston in person. And now, of course, we have the opportunity to convene online, which I think is part of the reason why I was able to assemble such a dream team today for all of you. And I want to just also give a shout out to this morning's panel, moderated expertly by Mary Skelton Roberts, and by all the takeaways that we heard from all of the panelists. It is tremendous. And maybe we'll get back with sort of a summary of highlights or something of this recording, because I think this is a very exceptional day. Of course, we're 4 days from a debate, and we're however many it is, 39 from an election that, the stakes could not be higher. So really what our panel is about is how do we get people to act? How do we engage them on the subject of climate change to use every single solution that is within their reach, and to understand the accomplishments that have already been made. And for that, we do need great communications, of course, and it's also, I think, very helpful to understand the behavior science in terms of what motivates people, what works to engage them. So that's what we're going to do today. As I said, the first debate is next week. 74% of the voters want the moderators to ask climate questions, but apparently not. That's not on the agenda. What is on the agenda for next week for the debate on Tuesday are the records of President Trump and former Vice President Joe Biden, 2, the Supreme Court, 3, COVID-19, 4, the economy, 5, race and violence in our cities, and 6, the integrity of the election. And of course, you could argue that climate cuts across all of those subjects. So I'm going to ask one question about that at the end of the presentations of the panelists, but I'm going to encourage all of you in the audience to post your questions in the chat, because I'm going to just ask one question and then I want to open it up for a free-for-all. So how do we get that light bulb to go off in people's heads, as Randy would say? How do we get people to get involved here? We're very fortunate to have this group here, and each one of them is going to present for 10 minutes, and then we'll have our Q&A. So I'll introduce first Elke Weber. So Elke, as you can read in the bio, is a professor triple appointed at Princeton University. She and I have gotten to know each other over the years in terms of our fascination with how do we encourage large organizations, ones that can really scale up ambition and impact, not just each one of us individually bringing our reusable bag to the grocery store, but how can we really leverage the large organizations, especially with the absence of federal leadership, on climate action that really matters. And so over the summer, I caught Elke on NPR talking about how we become used to statistics, even massive ones that shocked us initially. This is regarding COVID, but certainly applies to climate change and speaks also to Benji's point about numbers fatigue. So I think Elke has some rationale behind that. Isabel Wilkerson, in her absolutely mind-blowing book Cast, refers to this as the awkward becoming acceptable, and then the unacceptable becomes merely inconvenient. So how do we kind of stop that feedback loop in our own human nature in order to create the great transition and build back better that we all know we need to do? So Elke is an expert on this. We're most fortunate to have her here to help us sort through these behavioral insights that we should keep in mind when we are answering the question of how to get people motivated to do everything they possibly can and quickly, because the stakes couldn't be higher. So over to you, Alka.
Thank you so much, Sarah. And let me share my screen.
Thank you.
Let's see.
You can get it in display mode, maybe.
Yep. Here we go. And I was actually under the impression I had 15 minutes, but cut me off whenever.
No, it's okay. I think I actually was shorter than usual, so I think you have time.
So pleasure to be here. And yeah, what a fantastic morning this has been. Yeah, all this amazing new data, new faces for me. And so I've learned an awful lot. I'm going to take a somewhat larger view on the debate about sort of how to communicate. And let me so start with this figure that basically makes the point that we live in this time period that we've called the Anthropocene, where human behavior related to energy is shaping our environment, for better and mostly for worse. And that's a ruling assumption in that space really is one of rationality, that people do the numbers, that we use science. The economists talk about homo economicus. And that if there's not enough action, there must be an information deficit, and we just have to provide more science, or we have to communicate the science in a broader way. And of course, Randy already made the point that that might not be the be all and end all, that numbers are not necessarily what gets us there. So what I want to argue is that we're dealing with a different creature. We're not dealing with irrational homo economicus, we're dealing with us, homo sapiens. And I think sort of the points, the lessons I want to sort of give go across race, they go across income, they go across political ideology. All of us are not primarily creatures of rational deliberation. We can do it. We have the hardware for it, but we have to send our kids to college, to figure out how to do it right. What do we do instead? Well, we are creatures of habit. We learn very well from personal experience. I think Benji made this point repeatedly. That's why we have to make action local, because personal experience happens at the local level. And we use associations, emotions, and oftentimes rules to guide our actions. Again, Jackie made this point very well, sort of that narratives motivate emotions and guide actions. And then the last point to make is that we have many goals and oftentimes conflicting goals. Very few of us really want to destroy the planet we're living on. But other goals, whether it's convenience or profit motives, sort of get in the way of doing things that might be best for us in the long run. So where does this leave us with respect to climate change? Well, climate change really is a very tricky issue. The risk of negative consequences is very abstract. It is statistical in the future for most of us. And at the same time, solutions require the sustained attention on many fronts on cooperation. There really is no silver bullet. A carbon tax is not going to get us there. But there's plenty of silver buckshot, but it has to be applied in a coordinated fashion. And then the other thing is that the costs of action are upfront right now, they're for sure. And the benefits oftentimes are in the future. They're somewhat disputed, there are uncertainties involved with that. So all of that really makes status quo continue to do what we currently are doing, the common response. It's a recipe for that. And in many situations, continuing what you're doing, the devil that you know, can be seen as a conservative and somewhat safe option. The problem is that with climate change, and for that matter with COVID-19, business as usual is the worst possible option. It seems the most dangerous option. So what do we do? So what are our takeaways for climate change communication? I think the lessons we heard earlier this morning about making things local, about giving people agency and input, using participatory processes are hugely important, and I'm not going to repeat them. So let me build on those. All of the above, sort of all the earlier ones are completely important. But on top of that, let's sort of focus on the takeaway one: communicate with Homo sapiens. What does that mean? Well, we do pay attention what everybody else is doing, especially under times of uncertainty. And so perceived norms matter. What is everybody else doing? And so we should utilize our social networks. We need to identify influential leaders that people are paying attention to. So this notion of narratives and communications through trusted channels, I think, is very important. And then also to utilize our full set of ways in which we make decisions. That, as I said earlier, we do oftentimes calculate, we make decisions based on rationality with our heads, but we also make decisions with our hearts based on affect, on emotion, and based on rules and roles. And to just show you an example of that, we looked at consumer decisions made by customers of utilities, both in California, in the US, and in Switzerland. And we gave them options about the standard power, a brown power option that was cheaper, and a green power option that was more expensive. And as you see here, in both countries, like 2/3 of the population actually likes green power, they go for that. But then you can decompose that. We ask people afterwards, how did you make that decision, choosing which of these power plants to go for? And depending on sort of how much people indicated they were using their heads, they were calculating pros and cons, costs and benefits, the proportion of people who chose the green option went way down. But when they used their hearts, when they used emotions to make the decision, the proportion went way up. And when they used rules that came from their social identities, the proportion also went way up. So what that suggests is, yeah, we shouldn't just give people spreadsheets to figure out what's in it for them, but instead, yeah, we should motivate them in ways that, by images, by stories that touch their emotions and touch the rules of conduct that go with responsible citizenship and other rules. So takeaway number 2, I think, is make change simple. We all are busy. Information oftentimes comes in ways that is hard to process. A number of years ago, I got some scientists together to look at the different tools that we have to help people make more foresightful decisions, especially in the energy policy space. And there you find things like making information easier to access, presenting fewer options and choosing the most relevant ones, and making the option that sort of is in everybody's best short-term, long-term, and collective interest the default option. So why shouldn't we have green electricity as a default plan? And if you don't want it, you can opt out, rather than the other way around. Takeaway number 3 is attracting scarce attention. Yeah, we're not rational. We have finite attentional capacity, finite processing capacity, and many other things to pay attention to. And so it's not easy to capture people's attention. So we need positive messaging. I mean, Jackie made this point earlier. Benji made that point as well. Benji actually was practicing it very well in his presentations. So yes, we have to alert people about the dangers of climate change, but don't leave it at that. Yeah, basically also reassure them that there are feasible solutions and that we can get there. So not just gloom and doom, but also information about solutions, not just about the problems in an upbeat fashion. Secondly, labels really matter, metrics matter. Metrics, if we've been measuring our carbon footprints for a while, and if you measure something, you also can get better at it. And we all have this innate desire to do better. That's why video games are so addictive, because you can always do better in the next round. And so, but not just having the metrics, but what do we call those metrics? And so in terms of solutions, a carbon dividend certainly beats a carbon tax. A carbon user fee has connotations of polluter pays. And do these metrics make a difference? Let me show you an experiment we did 10 years ago, I think, in the United States, where we asked people whether they're willing to pay for a round-trip airline ticket that had a certain amount of cost, or a ticket that had an additional fee, a carbon user fee. And we explained on 2 pages of text sort of why it was the amount it was and how it was going to be used. The only difference was half the people saw this fee described as a carbon tax, and the other half as a carbon offset. And then afterwards, we asked them sort of for their lots of demographics, including their political ideology, party membership. And when the user fee was described as an offset, it didn't matter. 60% of all respondents actually sort of were willing to buy it. But when the same information was called a carbon tax, it didn't matter for the Democrats, but the willingness to actually buy this inclusive ticket went down to 27% for Republicans. The last point to make is that climate action oftentimes have a broad range of co-benefits that can be emphasized instead or in addition to environmental benefits. Here's an example of the EPA label that was introduced in 2012. in part because the metric miles per gallon was found not to be particularly good, and we should measure it in terms of gallons per miles. But while the EPA was added, they basically said, well, let's add a few other ways in which we can measure and communicate the impact of the carbon use of this car that you're thinking to buy, not just in terms of performance, but in terms of money, how much money you're saving or spending extra relative to the average car, or in terms of environmental impacts. And we thought at the time that maybe this was a terrible label. So much information gets crowded out. It's all very highly correlated. Well, it turns out when we did the study, this was actually a very nice label because people picked out those metrics that correspond to their needs. So people who are concerned about saving money look at this information in the label. The people who are concerned about performance look at this information. You can tell this by using eye movement tracking, or process tracing. And the people who are concerned about the environment look at these metrics. So actually we can communicate lots of different ways in which a certain consumer decision makes a difference in multiple different ways, and people will pick out the one that corresponds to their needs and to their goals. The last point to make is that the timing matters. Change is hard, and change is easier sometimes to motivate and to execute when your environment is already in transition. So when you're changing jobs, when you're moving, when the IT systems in your companies are changing, that's a good time to also introduce other changes, to suggest other changes. And of course, also utilizing crises, as we're doing right now, the COVID crisis, to implement change. This idea of building back better has a lot of validity. So can behavioral economics, or can these behavioral interventions that we're talking about, save the world? I think the answer is no, certainly not single-handedly. What we need instead is really action on all fronts. We do need supply side innovation. We need new technologies. We do need economic incentives. Yes, we need to have some price on carbon in some way to basically drive out externalities. We should subsidize renewables rather than subsidizing carbon fuel right now. Legal mandates make a huge difference, efficiency standards, renewable mandates. But on top of that, also there are lots of demand side innovations, behavior change at the consumer level, at the political level. And some of these tools that I introduced before sometimes go under the label of choice architecture. We heard earlier in the session about the importance of social movements, about norm change, and all the different ways in which we can facilitate that with storytelling. And I think sort of the takeaway in terms of making this scale up and fast is that we really need coordination across these different fronts. And so we should think about sort of how to build formal or informal institutions that actually sort of go across these different levels of interventions and build teams and build coalitions to design these policy packages that then can be delivered in an inclusive fashion. So let me just finish by thanking my many co-authors in this work and my funding partners, and you for your scarce attention.
Thank you so much, Elke. That was just fabulous and great food for thought, and thank you for looping it back to this morning's presenters as well. So on we go to Justin Worland. Our very best mainstream media can be a very powerful silver buckshot to build on Elke's point about a comprehensive all-in strategy. And I was captured by a stunning headline on the cover of Time magazine and Time.com in July. It said, 2020 is our last best chance to save the planet. Byline, Justin Worland, and I'm just going to read you the first paragraph. It won't take long to set him up. From our vantage point today, 2020 looks just like the year when an unknown virus spun out of control, killed hundreds of thousands, and altered the way we live day to day. In the future, we may look back at 2020 as the year we decided to keep driving off the climate cliff or to take the last exit. Taking the threat seriously would mean using the opportunity presented by this crisis to spend on solar panels and wind farms, push companies being bailed out to cut emissions and foster greener forms of transport in cities. If we instead choose to fund new coal-fired power plants and oil wells and thoughtlessly fire up factories to urge growth, we will lock in a pathway toward climate catastrophe. There's a divide about which way we'll go. So with that, Justin, I'm going to turn it over to you, and thank you for being here.
Well, thank you for having me and for taking the time to read that paragraph. I'm going to share my screen also. Just give me 1 second. Yeah, well, thank you for the introduction. Thrilled to be here. I'm impressed. It seems like a very engaged crowd. You know, I cover climate. I'm a correspondent at Time. I'm based in DC, particularly writing about the intersection of climate with politics and policy and society. And so I'm just going to break my remarks into basically 3 sections. Going to talk a little bit about the difficulties with climate journalism and communicating on climate, and then talk about how I've tried to address that, and then sort of third talk about audience, because I feel like it's often a question of who are we reaching, does it mean anything, and so I'm going to talk a bit about that. So the first point, well, first I'll just share this cover because you know, along with that paragraph, this is the cover that accompanied that story, and I just have to say it is a beautiful cover that I can take no credit for, but the image is beautiful, and I had to put it there. But climate journalism is hard. It's hard because journalists are trained to look for tension and to look for balance. And you know, climate change, climate science is an area where there is, of course, a lot of internal discussion and tension about where the science is exactly, but fundamentally, when you're presenting that picture to a broader public, you can't look for balance or for tension in the same way that you would in a political story. And so that's hard because it kind of goes against the instincts that every journalist learns. Climate change is hard to understand. And I mean that in 2 respects. One, it's hard to understand for a reader. This is complex science. And you know, as somebody who knows something about climate change, it's hard to convey that in a way that is easy enough for the average reader to understand. It's also hard to understand for journalists. And I would say that, you know, particularly when you think about general assignment journalists, political reporters, people who have to in some way cover climate change without having a real background in it or having it be their sort of day-to-day thing. And then I'd say for the final point, it's repetitive. And I say that for people who do cover climate change often. And what I mean by that is we are often hearing, we're often writing about reports that are the latest in a string of bad news about, you know, ice sheets or about really anything. And then it's also repetitive when it comes to climate impacts, when you talk about, you know, wildfires, or I can't tell you how many times somebody said, can you write a story explaining what storm surge is, right? Like this happens every year. So it's repetitive. So the question becomes, how do you create a new narrative? I mean, there's been a lot of discussion today about narrative. How do you sort of break through these sort of things that we hear over and over again and create new stories that people can engage with that are interesting, new, and important? And so I'm just gonna offer a anecdote first. These photos here, on the top 2 on the sort of spread, and then on the right have this farmer named Matt Russell. Matt Russell is a farmer in Iowa. He was a frequent campaign stop for Democratic candidates for president last year. He is a climate activist. He runs a group that tries to reach out to farmers on a faith, you know, talking about faith and climate change. And for that reason, all of these Democratic candidates went and visited him. Now, what did journalists, the political journalists who cover these campaigns, write about? Can Kamala catch Joe and Elizabeth in Iowa? And there's above, I cropped it, but there's a photo of Matt Russell meeting Kamala in Iowa. My favorite, O'Rourke campaigns with wife, looks to boost female support, right? So these are campaign stops where they were going to learn and talk about climate change. And the media, quote unquote, but the stories that came out of it were largely about unrelated things. The reason I bring this up, one, is because it's amusing, unfortunately, in a sort of sick way, but also because it kind of goes to the sort of fundamental thrust of my work, I think, for the last year and a half, which is that under most of the major news stories that we're talking about, there is a climate angle, there is a way to reach people and get them talking and thinking about climate in their everyday life, but also in the stories that they're talking about and thinking about for other reasons. So I'm going to give a couple examples of that, recent stories that I've done. The one on the left is about education and climate, and about the discussion about reopening schools, right? So this is a topic that we were all, maybe are still talking about, but we're talking about a month ago. And so, you know, I thought about how that conversation is very much, very similar to a conversation that I've heard from people in small island developing states, from many developing countries where they're dealing with challenges. How do you reopen after a natural disaster, right? So it's a very similar conversation. The idea is try to get people to expand their way of thinking about climate change and climate impacts while they're also thinking about COVID. At least the story on the right is about using this moment that we're having over the summer around race, around equity, to think about environmental racism, right? To talk about environmental justice and to center that. And I would say with both of these stories, I think it is really, you know, important to also, you know, beyond just connecting it in a way that people are talking about with regard to the news, but also the way to link this, you know, to other narratives about climate justice, about environmental justice, about justice more broadly, right? It's important to center those voices. And so that's part of the thinking with these two stories. And then I'll do two more, but these are, which are a little bit further out from maybe the way people are thinking about their personal life and experience. But one on the right about the US-China relationship, how that was central to climate discussions and how that could be going forward. And the other about cost-benefit analyses and the role that they've played or could play, both in thinking about when to reopen and also about how we address climate change. Again, the idea is to reach people in a new and different way around climate change and get them to think more broadly about what it is. My sort of last point is really just this question of who are we reaching? There's a lot of questions, you know, we've heard here, and I often hear, you know, are you swaying deniers? Are you motivating people? And first, I mean, as a journalist, we don't necessarily approach our work thinking, well, who am I swaying? Who am I convincing? But, you know, I would say a few points. One, for Time, certainly, and I think this is probably true with a lot of outlets that are really covering the climate story, our readers, you know, really, we're not reaching climate deniers. We're not necessarily probably reaching people who are, you know, somewhere between denier and activist, you know, people who are skeptical, or, you know, we're reaching people who have a college degree and, you know, by and large, you know, I shouldn't get too much into our demographics, but we're not really reaching those people who need to be convinced. However, I think it is important to think about, are we expanding the way in which people think about this issue? Are we turning people who, you know, would have acknowledged that climate change seems like a real thing, but haven't actually thought deeply about it? Are we reaching them and getting them to think more deeply about the issue, to care more about the issue? And I think that in some ways is just as an important discussion as, you know, are we reaching people who wouldn't have been reached otherwise? I zoomed through that. When I practiced it, I took a little bit longer. So I'll end there, but I look forward to any questions, and you know, I'm happy to talk and take this discussion in any direction in the Q&A. So thank you.
That's great. Thank you, Justin. Wanted to point out that you showed two of my favorite of your cover stories, and the third one might be the Person of the Year with Greta Thunberg on it, which I would refer everybody to as well. And I also wanted to applaud your involvement with the Covering Climate Now Coalition. And at Boston University, we are a founding institutional partner, and using this in the classrooms and so on, and WBUR in particular, which is our, it has taken this work very seriously, and you can see a lot of great climate change reporting there. And we hope that this coalition only builds and grows and proliferates, and that everyone will think hard about this very hard topic, as you say, and come up with ingenious ways of presenting the material so that it engages people where they are and where they really ought to be in a way, without being too heavy-handed and sticking to the truth, of course. So thank you. Next, we have John Marshall of Potential Energy, who, as he knows, absolutely enchanted me when I first heard about him. He has a fascinating concept. He's a veteran advertising executive. He has created a robust enterprise of convening top creative people at our leading advertising and marketing communications firms to, in effect, create a brand for climate change, as you might for hand soap or tomatoes, to see if we can sort of relieve the burden of the scientists telling the story about climate change and instead say, here we have all the very best communicators in the world. We will take what you're telling us, scientists, and now get it out to a mainstream audience and thereby foster the incredible mass engagement that we need in order to support all the solutions that need to be put into play to address climate change properly. So John, your co-founder, is familiar to many of us across the river, as we say, from Harvard. Dan Schrag, the director of the Harvard Center for the Environment, and that's a wonderful partner for you to have. And just eager for you to tell us more, especially about the rigorous database approach that you're using and that you do use, which is just absolutely fascinating when I first heard about it. Thank you. And what concepts you've discovered and key messages that have surfaced from this in-depth research, and maybe even a little bit of creative too, who knows. Thank you.
That's great. Well, thank you for having me. Yeah, I'm going to try and show a couple of ads, but hopefully the bandwidth will allow that. But first, I actually would love to share the research, and I think it's complementary and hopefully additive to some of the things that we've heard. So let me share my screen. Good. So yeah, so I founded this thing along with Dan Schrag at Harvard to, you know, at the behest of my 17-year-old who came home one day and said, "Dad, I'm locking you in the house for 2 days because you're not doing enough on climate change." So I phoned up a bunch of other marketing execs and CEOs and tried to see if we could bring some, you know, some new folks into the movement, those who are working in the for-profit sector. And I issued them a challenge like, this is by far the hardest product you'll ever try and sell. Do you want to put a team on this for free and see if you can make a contribution? So we've formed a network of really good technology firms, creative firms, and media companies to basically hatch campaigns that can try and move the needle on urgency. I also do a lot of work with Tony Lazarowitz at Yale. So we've done a lot of research together and have a common view of this. These are a couple of numbers from a survey I did last year. 27% are the number of people who are very concerned about climate change. And Tony has slightly different numbers with alarmed and concerned and so forth. And then 7% are the people who are highly active by some measure of, you know, talking about it a lot or being engaged frequently. And so like these numbers are pretty darn small given the global catastrophe that we face. And so what our mission has been is, you know, what can we do to try and get people to care more about this? You know, there's some features of this product that we're trying to sell that make it hard. One, it's, you know, this is changing, but it's actually pretty gradual. So the relevance isn't that high. It's you know, easily moves from a high issue to a low issue when something else hits the news cycle. And so it has a relevance issue. It's not a top of mind issue, but it also has a second problem, which is what I call an agency problem. 7.8 billion of us are causing it. And so it's a little difficult to feel like you can do anything about it. So it doesn't matter to you and you don't matter to it isn't a great recipe for selling a product. But we're giving it our best shot. And so we formed this network of about 200 advertising, media, and technology firms who are giving resources to lead these campaigns. This is our little launch event, and we've got a bunch of creatives who do stuff like this. So what I want to sort of pivot for maybe 5 or 6 quick minutes is some of our research. We've set up a bunch of laboratory tools as well as research tools, as well as in-market pilots to basically see what moves people, both from a persuasion and an engagement side. And we've all in, and a lot of this is digital testing. We've touched over 2 million people in the US. This is American data I'm going to show you. and it's a little sobering. I guess if I was going to give everyone on this meeting a message, it would be, it doesn't really matter how you feel about it. It matters how everyone else feels about it. And there's a pretty small group that would be encompassed by the kind of folks in meetings like this who have different perspectives, different levels of knowledge, and see the issue in a certain way. And that's just really different than the rest of the world. And so let me share with you some of those differences. Actually, before I do that, what a marketer does is they start with the consumer, and then they eventually figure out, okay, what product do they need, and how do I position it, and how do I communicate it? But it's kind of the reverse from what someone in the social issue or the NGO typically does. They'll typically start with an issue, and then hopefully, find the right way to get people to care about it. But I'm taking the reverse approach. I'm trying to find out enough about the individuals that I can figure out how to get them to take action that's relevant. So just to give you a little digital experiment that I did, I wanted to get a conservative in Florida to sign a petition that was really a climate change petition. And so this is a digital experiment. And the first try was pledge to talk about climate change. And there's a lot of theories that if we only talked about climate change more, we'd make it more people's consciousness. Well, that costs $80 per person. So that gets kind of expensive. And certainly I haven't raised enough money to make that happen. Demand a plan to get to zero emissions gets me down to $20. Demand a plan to make polluters pay gets me down to $350. So now I'm talking something that's a little more relevant to folks. And then if I'm in Pinellas County or Monroe County or Broward County, demand a plan to stop my flooding, I can get a petition signed for $1.52. Okay, and so the point of this is that relevance matters a lot, and it's unlike anything else. You have to go through what's happening in somebody's life rather than go through this particular phenomenon. So I'm gonna give you 5 conclusions. Some of them are pretty sobering, and they're a little provocatively phrased. But our research is basically telling us that people are largely clueless. They're not reading about this very much. It's not in the news. Tony Lazarowitz's data shares the same thing. They're really low information voters on the climate change issue. This is just a qualitative slide on this. I'll show you some actual data on the next slide. But the first thing I thought was, well, let me just go on down to the flood zones and in the Florida Keys and Miami Beach, and let's talk to people about climate change. So we did. We went down there. We did a bunch of focus groups, and we heard about chemtrails and astronauts and sharks and plastic straws, and this isn't that relevant to me. And then I did a focus group where I'm like, I'm not going to talk about climate change. So in the first 45 minutes, I'm just going to ask you what you're worried about in your life. And you got the traffic, and the shopping isn't as good, and the developers, and the flooding didn't really even come up until we prompted it, and then we found a way to get into climate change. So it's just not as high a concern as we think it might be, and the knowledge base is like staggeringly low. So this is what Americans think causes climate change. Most of them think it's caused by plastics. Twice as many people believe in the chemtrails conspiracy theory, where the government's putting chemicals in the contrails of airplanes to control our climate, as believe that a plant-based diet actually impacts our global climate. And less than a quarter of people right now understand that there's complete scientific consensus. Okay, so it's just got to live in that reality for a second. The market isn't ready to buy this product the same way we'd like it to be. And then you ask yourself the question, oh, but the people who are really highly engaged in this. So I looked at the 7% of most highly engaged activists, and they actually are less informed than your average American. 63% of them believe it's about plastics. 56% of them conflate it with the ozone hole. And 33% think recycling makes a big difference. And so there's a lot of foundation building that doesn't exist in this country. And it's really important that we don't assume that your average person, when we're trying to come up with narratives, understands what we understand. I'll give you an example of that. Clean energy has certainly got super cheap over the course of the last 10 years. Solar prices are down 86%. Wind is down 40%. But the percentage of Americans who think that renewables have become less expensive is 19.7%, less than 1 in 5. And so it's really a big mistake to make a presumption that, okay, all we need to do is sell clean energy, because most people think of it as an expensive liberal luxury. And that's what the data says. And so the foundations of what is the nature of the problem and what is the nature of the solution do not exist in the American mind. Now, one of the reasons is we're selling a concept which is very vague, climate change. Climate, by the way, is not even an adjective, but we've decided to adopt it as an adjective and have climate policy and climate action and climate this and climate that. But on its face value, it goes through no circuitry in the human mind of what a climate change is. And so we really have equipped ourselves really poorly to get across some of the foundational problems that we're facing. So we have a clueless, very uneducated public. We did a lot of work to figure out, well, if we can't afford to move everybody, who should we actually try and persuade? And by the way, it's not more educated people. It's not people with advanced degrees. It's not even younger people who, yes, are more concerned, but they're 3% more concerned about climate change than the rest of us. So the concept that this is massive youth movement ready and waiting to save us is not borne out by the data. If I'm trying to find a segment of the population that I can actually talk to about this and move and turn into voters, it turns out to be about a 50-year-old woman. And by the way, 92% of people I can move are women. So we sort of left men aside from a targeting point of view. Twice as likely to be Hispanic, equal parts Republican and Democrat, very concerned about pollution, don't have a lot of engagement in climate change. And so what we're trying to do is come up with a segmentation where you can say, where do you start? And we're very interested in the mom. That tends to be the sweet spot. And there's a lot of people that the traditional environmental groups don't talk to because they don't necessarily have that makeup. We're running a big campaign now called Vote Like a Madre with Jennifer Lopez and Jessica Alba and Eva Longoria, where we're trying to get 5 million Hispanic women to donate their vote to their kids, because we found that that's like a sweet spot in the climate movement. So that's point 2. The third thing, and I think this comes through in the data a lot, like we often think that the framing is between belief and denial, but the actual issue is really about caring versus not. When we look at message testing and RCTs, we can pretty much move almost anybody. And there's really very little backlash. So we can get a lift on deniers, we can get a lift on people in the middle, and we can get a lift on people on the left. The reason for that is people aren't engaged or they're not talking about it. We can get a lift with conservatives as well. And so the main message I'd like to leave with folks is we actually have to do this. We have to talk to people about it. We have to educate them in terms that actually work. So what works and what doesn't work? What doesn't work is what we're doing now, because somehow we've decided that we should just take policy language into the consumer sphere. When I first started this effort, I was really excited about this concept that we've got to stop talking about the problem. Let's talk about the solution. And I love this idea of get to zero emissions by 2050. And I was all ready to call my organization Stop at Nothing. I had logos and banners and I was ready to go. And then we started to test it digitally. And this is the cost of getting someone to enroll in a petition. If I ask you to demand a plan to get to zero emissions by 2050, it's 5 times as expensive if I ask you to demand a plan to tax polluters or to save Florida. And there's just been a scourge of policy language that's just snuck in to our vernacular that means nothing to your average person. Zero, what do you mean zero? What's an emission? What are you talking about? We're not gonna do this. People don't know what carbon is. We should have called it soot. They don't know what emission is. We should call it pollution. We just haven't constructed the language around this. And we can go talk about our carbon footprint all we want, but you're talking to 4% of Americans if you're talking about your carbon footprint. If you're talking about air pollution, you're talking to 99% of Americans. So there's a big need to get rid of policy language and start putting consumer language in place. I have some kind of sobering learnings that just come from the data. We're still looking at it, so I could be wrong, by the way, because this is so hard. There's always more iterations you can do. We found that worry is more motivating than optimism. That's just what the data is saying. If I give you a worry message, I get more response than if I give you a we can solve this message. In fact, my we can solve this messages are the lowest performing messages of all of my messages. And now that may not be the case for the people who know about it, because there's an education deficit. People don't know what the this is that we're solving. So why should they get excited about clean energy when they think it's an expensive liberal luxury? They don't have the foundation. You can't go to a solution message without first building the worry and the foundations behind it. Interestingly, I tested climate crisis as a term. Yes, it's a crisis. It'll be a crisis for the next 5 decades, but it actually performs a lot worse in marketing communications than other language like pollution and climate change. Most people don't see it as a crisis. They don't feel it as a crisis. We would like to tell them it's a crisis, but if we start with the audience, it's not a crisis to them. And then I have discovered, sadly, that motivating personal action is extremely expensive. I had a big hypothesis that we could run a big campaign. My next car is an electric car. You don't have to do anything. You just badge yourself socially. And it's brutal how expensive it is to do lead generation for people to buy an electric car. And so it is going to be a long slog if we think we're going to go through a behavioral pathway. We're going to have to go through an activism pathway. The economics on getting people to do behavioral change at mass scale are not very promising, at least from our data. What we have found works, because I probably should end with some of that, is when you wrap it in mental models and metaphors, it makes sense to the wiring of the human brain. I'm using this term pollution blanket, and it's performing really well. And oftentimes I'm not even using climate change in our tests. We find that actually does well. Pollution framing is great, works super well. We have to have the courage to call CO2 a pollutant, regardless of what our scientific makeup may tell us. It is causing major problems, and so we call it a pollutant, it works. We call it carbon and methane and emissions and CO2, it doesn't work as well. Localized worry works very well. So my identity, my neighborhood, my flooding, my insurance costs, money, preparation, and prevention tend to work well. And then my personal favorite is generational messages targeted at moms. First of all, moms tend to listen more than anyone else, and they tend to care more than most. And so I really have heart for the generational idea. Not that the kids are going to save the parents, but the parents are going to save the kids. But that mostly comes through moms. So those are some of our learnings. I don't know how we're doing on time.
Thank you. I think our guru, David Cash, the Dean, says that we need to start wrapping up, but he's hoping that you might have a couple of ads to show, maybe one now and maybe even more. But I'll show you one ad. We have a theory that you got to go through personal relevance and humor, and so I'll show you one afterwards. So this one, has everyone ever heard of the Florida Man meme? What?
Yes, Florida Man.
Yeah, so this ad got a 19% lift in concern about climate change among high school educated males. So we sort of started with with the core audience. So this is an ad to try and get Floridians to think about flooding, and this is an actual guy in Florida who is part of our campaign.
It all started as a simple routine beer run.
We can't see anything, John.
Me and my buddy.
Oh, you can't see anything?
No, now share your screen again.
Oh, I'm not sharing my screen. That would help to share my screen to show you something. Yeah.
Love it.
It's a real guy. He lives in a trailer. He has a pet squirrel, and we just found that going through culture and humor is maybe better than going through alarmism and shock.
Well, thank you so much. And if you have any others up your sleeve, I'm sure we'd love to see them. But maybe we should just shift to the Q&A a little bit. I thought I'd lead off with a question for all three of you, and I had one prepared about the debate situation, but I think we've sort of covered that. So I'm going to put the three of you on the spot just a little bit. I'd love to hear each of you talk, and maybe you can even talk with each other. But what do you think of what each other just presented? What was useful to you, Elka, about what you saw of Justin and John's work, and Justin of what did Elka and John have to say to you, and John, what of Justin's and Elka's remarks? So I was just wondering if the three of you could sort of talk a little bit and then maybe go at it. And then we'll ask some questions from the audience.
Sure, maybe I can start.
Thank you.
Let's see. I think sort of one takeaway has been that sort of when we talk about people responding to climate change or action on climate change, people are not homogeneous, right? I mean, sort of I made the distinction about sort of Homo sapiens as opposed to Homo economicus, but Homo sapiens, we come in many different flavors, and clearly sort of what we care about, first of all, Americans are different from other cultures, but even within America, we have many subcultures. We talk about different motivations. Being a parent makes a huge difference, as John told us. And so it really is sort of different strokes for different folks. And so I think to get the right level of market segmentation, sort of in advertising speak, I think is important. And then the question is, what is that? And Benji was talking in the previous session about the generational divide, but John seems to suggest that's maybe not sort of where things are at. So I think it's sort of there's the importance of figuring out who your target audience is, and then trying to figure out what motivates them. Maybe sort of one word about the importance or negative versus positive messaging. There were some questions from the audience about what John meant when things work or not. And as much as I could follow, it means that people click on your ad, right? And that's where the costs come from, how much you have to pay for these ads. Now that is a response, and it certainly is some indication about how many people care about this issue enough to take a very simple step. But if we talk about really important and long-lasting climate action, whether it's motivated by concern about climate or by other things, it's much more complex. It's more than clicking on an ad. And the kind of things that work for clicking on an ad might not be the kind of things that work in the long run to sort of sustain a behavior and have a different narrative. So I think we have to be careful what we say and what we generalize it to.
I have one thing that struck me about your presentation, which I loved because it had data. I've been asserting it, now I can use data, is that the path through the emotions is much stronger. And we sort of believe that in our industry because that's kind of what we do. But I think one thing that's tricky about climate change is it tends to attract a cerebral type of person because it's very complicated and there's a lot of thinking involved in getting your head around it. And so it has an appeal to a left-brained type of person. And then we're driving a lot of rational conversations, and even that's just a lot of volume of stuff to get across. And so I think other social causes tend not to have that problem as much. They put the injured animal or the starving kid up there, and then just they work the emotions. And I think that's the thing that we need to figure out how to do, because humans don't process the factual stuff in the same way as they do really simple imagery and really simple ideas. And it's kind of hard for us in the movement because it tends to be a fairly cerebral crowd that get drawn to climate change.
Mm. Interesting. What about you, Justin?
Well, I mean, I think the first thing that is always sort of what happens when I hear presentations like these is it's a sobering reminder of how little people are being reached, which is, I mean, it's just the reality. And I said this in my own presentation, I know who our audience is, and it's not necessarily the people who aren't understanding or paying attention to these things to begin with. And I guess the other point to make is just, it's always a reminder as well of how disconnected the business of media is from the different, the knowledge, the data we have about communication. Because, I think this is true in lots of different respects, but media is in large part responsible for creating these narratives that the public will receive. And, truthfully, we're not doing it in a data-oriented way as you all are working on. And so it's interesting because I always do wonder what better ways there are to collaborate. At the same time, there's lots of different. I feel like I get lots of different messages, and so it's always hard to know what could that actually mean for my work. So those are my sort of initial thoughts.
Really interesting. I'm obsessed, as I mentioned, with the whole idea of like pushing people, even those who are engaged on this and do care to some extent, to really say to themselves, so given my social circles, given my networks at work or wherever I am, how can I scale this up? What could I be doing? What could I be doing more? I remember that the convener of the MIT Solve conference was asked, or maybe she asked herself, so what can we all be doing? And her answer was more. So I really think that, every day, if those of us who do care about this right now and who can be influential in some way, if we continue, as all of you are, to think of ingenious, innovative, new channels, ways to reach people who maybe do already care, then that feeds on itself, especially if they're people who can then, say, okay, so I'm, senior vice president or CEO of some big corporation. I can actually really make a change happen here, and then celebrate those successes and hold them accountable. Like, are you just saying this, or is it for realsies? All right, some questions from the audience. So one of them would be from Clemence Moinier: to touch people's emotions, what do you think about the role of movies? Is there a risk that movies and documentaries intended to sensitize are actually irrationally, subconsciously perceived as fiction, increasing the disconnect between people and the issue? And then I'll throw in another one, and you guys can choose one or the other. This is from Julie Wormser. I'm interested in the difference in persuasion for people not yet directly affected versus people who are already experiencing climate impacts. With climate impacts becoming more widespread and visible, for example, the people in New Orleans have a completely different experience than those of us in Boston. But can we move to language around consensus solutions? Or, isn't it true that we need to sort of stay really focused on what matters most to the people in their areas? So, and then to tie back to the first question is, how can film help us with that? I know the one that blew my mind was Al Gore's first movie, but interestingly, the first time I saw it was presented by Al Gore himself at a college where my son was. And I just couldn't get over that Al Gore just wasn't doing it for me. And I won't go into any details, but happy to offline over a glass of wine. So it sort of went in one ear and out the other in a way. But then the next time I saw it, it was a fellow mom, to John Marshall's point about mothers, Lori David, who is executive producer on the film, who presented it again in person. And I looked at her and I thought, she could be a friend of mine. We're not that different. So oftentimes it's like the messenger often is so powerful, and the trusted messenger, we've heard all about how scientists and doctors and nurses are all trusted messengers. And that's really important to think about, like who do you trust, especially now? But just what kinds of other people do you trust? And that gets back to the whole point about personal responsibility. When we think about who do we take advice from, and who listens to our advice in our lives? Well, why not increase sort of the activity within those tribes and circles? Stick out your neck just a little bit more than perhaps you already have been. Comments?
I haven't thought about the messenger is actually usually more important than the message in most things. And so unexpected messengers, really important. I saw a piece of
like that guy, Florida man.
Yeah, exactly. Well, that's what I picked up. But interestingly, so scientists are still considered the most credible messengers from the research. And the number two is farmers. And it just seems really interesting to think about mobilizing the farmers, the fishermen, like different people from walks of life, homeowners associations, like the burden needs to move away from the environmentalists toward citizen. And there's so many interesting spokespeople that can be mobilized on this and then if they talk with different terms about the same problem, it seems to be a really interesting possibility.
Absolutely.
No,
please.
I'll just remark briefly on the bit about movies, and I think I would say I think it's important that culture more broadly starts to understand and grapple with climate change. I mean, I think that a lot of people who aren't reading journalism, maybe they will be, swayed by the Florida Man ad, but they come to understand a lot of things through television and through other pop culture, and so the more that these cultural concerns can grapple with the issue, the more people will be aware. I don't have data behind it, but there has been written a lot written from there's been a lot written about it that's not necessarily data driven.
So lots of important points raised by you, Sarah. So let me maybe comment on the point about the importance of personal experience and extreme events that we're all seeing increasingly around the country. And it's absolutely true that seeing is believing. I mean, seeing something with, sort of personal experiencing, being in a hurricane or forest fire sort of changes your attitudes in lots of ways. But of course, it's important that you attribute that, to climate change. And as John was showing us, that's not necessarily the case. We might do that, but most people don't. And it's also, but our data actually show that when people do experience negative consequences of climate change and make that attribution, they're hugely affected by that. And it's the people at the bottom of the initial sort of willingness to act, typically conservatives, who are most affected by it, but everybody's affected by it. At the same time, it's also true that we don't live in the same reality. And so while seeing is believing, believing is also seeing. We perceive events in our environment in a way that's consistent with our ideological beliefs. And if you don't, there's solution aversion, and people living in the same county will have a differential report, reporting extreme events, that might be connected to climate change as a function of their political ideology. So it's not quite so simple to think, well, eventually things will get bad enough that we're all on the same wavelength and we'll do something about it. We're not quite there yet.
I did a survey of Florida coastal property owners, and I asked a simple question: will your property value go down or up in the next? I think it was either 10 or 20 years. And it was like 54% said down, 46% up. It was some split. And then I did the correlation to your political affiliation, and your answer was entirely driven by your political affiliation. And so, but your neighbor is going to have the same problem. So eventually, that decoupling will happen. The problem is the lag time is several years. And so I think if you can make the connection and have people see it and then see that their property value is actually going down and their neighbor's property value is going down, it might be able to unpack it. But right now we all make the choice to believe in it through a major lens, which is our political affiliation. We don't really make the choice through any other lens. And so I think that's the point, okay, you're making. Like if you make the connection, people can see it in a different way, but left without the connection, it's all done through the filter.
Mm-hmm.
Which is incredible because, that filter is just, it seems to be like unfixable on our collective eyeballs at this moment. Whereas, as we've seen with the coronavirus, I mean, science, viruses, Mother Nature don't give, to use Benji's term, a bull crap about political affiliation or national borders or, any of that. They're just going to continue to happen. So, part of the fascination of this, this left-brained person about this subject is, how the hell, how does this get solved? And is it going to be made easier because we, can begin to take some reasonable steps here, or, with every day, the window of that possibility seems to be closing. So there's going to be a lot of kicking and screaming as entire, industries perhaps have to be shut down, but moreover, as people realize, oh, so my oceanfront condo is literally underwater. Now the dean is reminding me that at 1:15, which is in 5 minutes, we're going to have an adjournment here with some closing remarks. So, John, I'm going to ask you if you brought any other things in your goodie bag to show us, because we would love to see if you do.
Yeah, I mean, I had to take a break earlier. I didn't know if you had seen the ad that we did with Benji.
Wait, can I make a suggestion?
Yes.
That at 1:15, when we adjourn, if you can roll those ads, and then people who want to stay to watch them can watch them. But between now and 1:15, we hear, a summary from each of the three of you and Sarah. Does that make sense?
Well, that makes perfect sense to me. And it'll all be in the recording too, right, David?
Correct. Yeah.
Correct. Okay, summary then. I turn it over to the three of you. You're all brilliant. Please. Any summary?
I think we're all being polite to each other. You cold call them. My summary line is, we got to meet people where they are and then take them to a new place. We can't meet people in the place that we are. It's too expensive and we don't have time. We've got to figure out how to come in through beliefs and identities when's the last time you convinced someone to change their mind by telling them they were wrong? Like, not too often. And so what do they write about and find a way to fit this in? We had a great campaign that someone came up with, which is called I Have My Reasons. And it was just, everyone has their reason to care about this. And so finding that, and not pushing our reasons on other people, but finding theirs in order to enroll them, maybe a big part of the key.
John, do you have, during these next, whatever it is, 38 and a half pivotal days, will any of this messaging informed by your research be on the air at all?
No, I don't know. I mean, we're trying.
What are next steps for like when?
Oh, well, the big thing that's on the air is I mean, I just believe that there's 32 million Latinx Americans who can save the world, and so we're marketing with them like crazy. So not that many people on here may see that, but that's who we're going after, is the Hispanic mom, and so they're getting a lot of marketing. That basically it's a huge viral pinky promise to promise your kids you'll vote on climate change. So that's what's happening.
How do we catch up with that? Is there like a hashtag, or what are we doing?
Yeah, votelikeamadre.com.
Votelikeamadre.com.
Yeah.
Great. And did you say there's a book associated with that?
No, sorry, I misspoke.
Okay. All right. I'm always thinking of books. Elka, anything in summary, especially with the next 38.5 days in mind?
Yeah, so I do think we're putting way too much of a burden on individuals with solving our climate crisis. And it's our politicians who are falling down on the job. And if you think about, we put a lot of, we delegate a lot of our decisions to other experts, medical decisions to medical doctors, legal decisions to lawyers. And, and we have politicians because we all realize collectively we have neither the interest nor the ability to make our long-term planning, social planning decisions and strategic planning decisions. But at the same time, we don't live in an environment where we sort of truly have, a democracy. Politicians have lots of vested interests and in re-election issues. So I think sort of restructuring our political system would be a step in the right direction, and putting all of this burden just because corporations are, we can't get a carbon tax in place, and therefore corporations can't give up on their stranded assets. And all of a sudden, mom and pops have to solve the problem. I think that's very unfair and very unrealistic. At the same time, there are things that people can do, and I think sort of voting, and voting the right people in and voting the wrong people out is a step in the right direction.
Yeah. What about you, Justin? What do you think?
I guess I would just say, you mentioned the debate topics and the lack of inclusion of climate, and I would say, I mean, obviously that's an issue, but I would say I think it's incumbent upon journalists to try to find ways to explain the way that climate is related to their lives and to the issues that we're talking about, even if that means, looking at that debate topic and thinking, how are those issues related to climate change?
Exactly.
And why should you be thinking about it in that way?
Exactly. And Biden's team's got to be doing that. I mean, this gives him an opportunity to talk about it, 6 different ways.
Right, exactly.
Great. Well, thank you so much, Justin, Elka, and John. And thank you so much, Sarah, for fantastic moderating of this panel. Again, like the first panel, we could easily have gone on another half hour, 45 minutes, maybe a couple of hours. And the 4 of you have really dived into the issues that were kind of tabled for us by the first panel with folks on the ground, to how you guys have interpreted making meaning out of this and selling this literally, and persuading people and helping them think about it. So thank you so much. What we have now is closing with Catherine Elms and Alex Popoli, both who are on our steering committee and both who were part of the planning committee for this event. So let me hand it to you. You guys will have the last word. And if John, if you can hang around and show your videos, anyone who wants to stay can stay, and we'll watch a couple more videos. So let's hear it to Catherine and Alex.
Great, thanks, David, appreciate it. And thanks to everybody who went. This is not an easy discussion to kind of cap off, because there was just so much meat on the bones here. And to go back to the start, with everything that was outlined at the outset by Paul and David at the beginning, we're seeing wildfires, hurricanes, tidal flooding, and the list goes on. And as Lorena identified, we have notable gaps in preparedness, especially across income and racial lines. And with the immediacy of those impacts, the time to act on climate is now. Unfortunately, action is immediately feasible, but as so many of the panelists mentioned today, communication is challenging, and consensus and standardized messaging are seemingly impossible. And so I think back to Jackie and Benji and Randy and how they highlighted the importance of linking narratives to lived experience, of demonstrating how those that might experience impacts, especially disproportionate impacts, can act and contribute to change, or how those looking for economic opportunity might be able to benefit from jobs or incentive mechanisms that stem from climate solutions. And given our audience, I'd like to focus on the actions that businesses and institutions can take. And I'll also pick up on something that Benji highlighted, that we can lean on capitalism. And it surprised me to be saying that, but we can lean on capitalism, and we can lean on local communities and businesses. And although federal action is important, given the urgency of this issue, and especially given the urgency of political or uncertainty of political futures, we can't wait for state level, national level, or multinational scale consensus, guidance, and policy. And we have to act now, and business communities have a real stake in this. Just as individuals and communities need to prepare for the impacts of climate change, so do businesses. They need to identify the risks that climate change can pose to their businesses, and they need to internalize costs. And this is starting to happen. So I want to be a bit optimistic. Businesses can and are increasingly investing in emissions reductions and removal credits. Recently and visibly, we've seen commitments from Microsoft, Google, Delta, BCG, Spotify, the list goes on. And the commitments aren't empty. They're being matched with action. I'd also like to link back, that makes me think of Elka's point on status quo bias. Unfortunately, business as usual is no longer an option for businesses. So we do need these continued commitments to emissions avoidance and removals. And beyond that, we also need more innovation. And I think that's something that a number of folks also flagged. We need new technology and novel incentives, whether compliance-based or voluntary. And Elka noted supply side innovation and economic incentives like a price on carbon. She also noted demand side, behavior change, choice, changing norms. And we need that innovation to happen, and we need it to happen in ways that can resonate broadly. And I love how much John really framed out the challenges of getting those points across, and how effective communication might not be what we expected. But I wasn't going to focus on this, but given Elka's framing and the multiple call outs today on farmers in both the first and second panels, to use a personal example, I spend my day-to-day working at Indigo Ag. And for those of you who don't know what we're up to, we have a carbon business unit. We've made it our business to incentivize growers to become carbon farmers and to sequester carbon in their soils and be paid for it. And so to connect back to the first discussion, I was thrilled to hear that Benji was calling in from a farm and honing in on on-farm climate solutions. It was a huge surprise. And it's these individuals and local communities that need to be a part of the solution. And the narrative and potential for action has to resonate with them and align with their lives and their greatest concerns. So when it comes to farmers, for example, who have incredibly thin margins and have no control over things like weather and extreme weather events that can make or break their crops and profitability, we want to empower them to take action that can move the needle on climate change while making their operations more economically and environmentally resilient. And this message has worked. It's resonated with growers and in communities that you wouldn't think to equate with populations most concerned with climate change. And I had to smile during John's presentation when he mentioned localized worry and identity and neighborhood, as well as money and preparation and prevention. A farmer's livelihood is as localized as it gets. And in less than 2 years since we've launched, we've already had over 20 million acres of expressed interest. That message has worked. And then if I flip it to the buy side, we have large buyers lined up to purchase agricultural carbon credits. And that's actually in the absence of established standards, accounting frameworks, and rule books. No one's making them do this. No one's making buyers implement net zero plans. They're doing it themselves because they understand the urgency and criticality of this for their businesses. So I really encourage everyone on the line to do the same. And I also want to quickly return to some of the tactics that Randy mentioned in conveying how climate action can relate to public housing development and green energy and living standards. I'm really optimistic that the co-benefits like that can be incredibly effective. So returning to the farming example, because that's what I know, there are real co-benefits of natural climate solutions for carbon removals. Yes, we can get carbon sequester, but we can also get other environmental benefits that can include things like improved water retention and minimized runoff and nitrification. And as I mentioned a minute ago, solutions like this can benefit the individuals, local economies of those who actually implement the solutions, like growers. And that's just one example. But as we heard today, there are so many other ways to link climate action to individual and business imperatives and to facilitate action now. And
can you wrap, Catherine?
Yeah, wrapping. I'll wrap it with, yes, we still need the state, national, and multinational government action, but we also can't let perfect be the enemy of the good. We've learned today that there's no such thing as perfect communication strategy. There's no universally satisfactory policy mechanism or regulation. And so when it comes to the technology at hand, it takes time to develop these solutions. It takes time to get the policies off the ground. We don't have the luxury of time. We can't wait to act. We need it now. And I want to pass it off to Alex, because I know that he can touch on how to help rally the troops, and also express a thanks to folks like Justin who help get these stories out there.
Great. Thanks, Catherine. All right, Alex, bring us on home.
Okay, thank you, Catherine. And thanks to all the panelists for a very provocative discussion. There's so much to talk about here and touch on. I'll try to be quick. Just want to recognize what Jackie said initially about approaching this with principles and values, as a foundation for how we move forward. And the Hamas principles that you mentioned are a great start. I'm going to put them in the chat. If anyone wants to take a look at those and are not familiar, they provide a common grounding that can bring, all of us together. If we want all of us to be mobilized and participate in climate action, these solutions that we're putting forward need to be valuable to all of us. And I would say that they have to address it. We're not just environmentalists. We're not just middle class or immigrants or whatever. We and our neighbors are all of these things, and so our solutions have to address concerns about racial injustice and poverty, and if we want China and sub-Saharan Africa and Puerto Rico and Central America to join the climate train, we got to think about the impact of colonialism. These are not obscure and unrelated questions. We've also been talking today a lot in terms of bipartisanship, and conservative versus liberal. But if anyone's paying attention to the tenor of conversations on the street over the last, couple of years, really, the spectrum has shifted so broadly, and unfortunately, the extreme far right is now mainstream, as well as conversations about structural. I mean, that's a recurring theme, is conversations about structural change and systemic problems. And people are so. I would like to offer a quote. At the risk of seeming ridiculous, let me say that the true revolutionary is guided by a great feeling of love. It's impossible to think of a genuine revolutionary lacking this quality. This is from Comandante Che Guevara, who, as shocking as it is to maybe for some folks to invoke Che in this kind of forum, it doesn't seem that controversial. Love and fairness and mutual respect and a healthy community sharing. These are values that can unite us all and bring a lot of folks together under a common umbrella. And it can expose the opposition's violation of these principles that we hold dear. I'll just close by saying we've been in an extractive relationship with the earth and with each other for centuries now. And it's not going to come cheap to fix these things. It's just not. But if we see this cost as an investment that we're making in a world that we're trying to build with these values underlying it, we can seize the remaining time, the window of opportunity that we have, as Justin named in his cover story, to fix some of the greatest challenges that are facing us, and and emerge with some hope for our children and their children. So I'll just leave you with that. John, I'm really looking forward to your next ad.
Thanks, everybody. Fantastic, Alex and Catherine, for wrapping up that way. Fantastic job, everybody. That brings us to a close, and we'll continue to show the videos for anybody who wants to stay. Thank you again to all the panelists and moderators. Have a great day.
I'd really like to just put in a quick plug for our next event, which is next Thursday, the Climate Cocktails event, which is a free networking event that we're hosting. I really hope everyone can join and network with each other and have an opportunity to meet other people who are just as excited as you are about climate adaptation. And then please save the date. Our next forum is coming up on November 20th. It will be virtual as well, creating connections, resilience, and equity in transportation. So really appreciate everyone joining today. I just want to thank you all for taking the time. I know it's a lot of time to take out on a Friday morning. We'll be posting the available presentations to the website. Everybody will get an email with a link to those presentations. The program was recorded, but we haven't figured out exactly how we're going to put that on the website. So that will also come to you in a direct email. So thank you very much.
All right, I'll show you an ad. Is it to me?
Yep. Go for it.
No. Oh, there's no screen sharing left anymore. It's been disabled.
Oh, hold on. I'll fix that for you. There you go. Okay, now.
Okay, this is Vote Like a Madre, which just launched 2 weeks ago. This is a massive pinky promise your kids you'll vote to fight climate change. It's this intro video that Jayla did for us, but the ad is here, and it's really fun. So let me make sure we're ready to go. Whoever's still on the line, you can feel free to do this on Instagram. There's thousands of people are doing it. Grab your kid, do a pinky promise with the hashtag Vote Like a Madre, whether you're Hispanic or not, and spread the word.
You still got 125 people who are watching, so
Yeah.
they're rolling.
You want to see another ad?
Yeah.
All right. I haven't made that many, so we're gonna run out of runway here. Okay, this we did with Benji. It's called this we ran on Fox News to get to a conservative audience. All right, David, that's all I got for now.
Fantastic, John. Thank you so much.
Thank you very much. Appreciate it.